Yesterday, July the 9th, marked the anniversary of the launch of the African Union, the successor of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. Now, much has been said over the years about the African Union as a body and its contribution to building the continent that we want. And one of those pillars being democracy, that the AU even adopted a special charter in this regard in 2007 called the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. So just how well has the continent done regarding the development of democracy? Well, the African Presidential Leadership Center released its updated Democracy in Africa fact sheet. And to tell us a little bit more about this, I'm now joined by the board chairman, Ambassador Charles Stith. Ambassador, thanks so much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Well, Peter, thank you for having me this evening.
All right, so some people might say, you know, depending on where they are on the continent, that democracy has been slow in coming, but you've been looking at the continent in its entirety. How well have we done since the early days of the OAU and particularly the AU?
Well, the good news is that democracy's roots are growing deeper year by year. We started tracking the democratization trends on the continent back in 2001. And one of the indicators of how well democracy is doing are the number of democratically retired African heads of state. In 2001, there were only 11. And most people could only name one, and that was Nelson Mandela. Today, which we punctuated in our updated Democracy in Africa fact sheet, today there are 55 democratically retired African heads of state on the continent. That's a five-fold increase over the last 2 decades. That's great news. Those 55 presidents reflect the electoral process in 16 countries. We've just added Ethiopia to the list, which brings the list of what could be categorized as true democracies to 17 countries. So the bad news is you've got 54 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and only 17 are legitimately democracies. Now, the other good news is those 17 countries are the most heavily populated on the continent. So close to 60% of the population on the continent of Africa live in countries where the citizens have the right to participate in electing their own leadership and holding that leadership accountable.
All right. So, Ambassador, that means 37 countries on the continent are not true democracies. Why is this number still so large?
Well, one of the reasons is that there's really no vehicle to drive the sort of change that is required. You mentioned the African Union being the successor entity to the Organization for Africa Unity. That was a step in the right direction. But, you know, after 18 years, as I've said, there are now 17 countries that could legitimately be called democracies. When the AU was inaugurated, that number was 13. And the reality is the change that we've seen has been driven within countries rather than by the Organization for African Unity. One of the problems, quite frankly, with the African Union being more of a precipitator of that kind of change is that the system of governance is based on one country, one vote. And obviously, if the autocrats outnumber the Democrats, that's with a small d, by 7-1, it's going to be hard to rally them to the cause of elections that might mean the end of their reign. So if you're going to see a change that's precipitated by the African Union, quite frankly, I think you'll have to have a different system of governance rather than one country, one vote. The vote ought to be weighted proportionally reflective of the populations. If that happens, of course, then those states with the larger populations, which happen to be democratic, will become the driving force, and I think you'll see a much more change because you'll have an entity that can help hold people accountable.
You must be quite heartened with what happened in Malawi, where the courts stood up to government and said these elections were not okay, you've got to do it again. And they stood by that, and in the end, the people's voice was heard.
Yes, I mean, and one of the things, look, we talked about the African Union, but quite frankly, one of the great precipitating factors in the political changes we've seen across the globe, not just in Africa, is social media. People have greater access to the ebb and flow of events internationally. People have, because of social media, a greater sense of what's possible in terms of political change. And as a result of social media, people have a better understanding of what is happening within their countries as well as outside their countries. And we've seen that drive all sorts of movement for political change. We've seen it in terms of democratization on the continent of Africa. We've seen it with the Black Lives Matters movement that started in the United States, but we've seen some manifestation of it all around the globe. So, that's the good news, that there are mechanisms out here that keep people connected and enable people to organize to move for political change and particularly democratic change in the countries in which they live.
So how do you measure this democracy update of yours? You said there's 17 countries now, you've added one. How do you measure what democracy means? Because some people might say China might not be very democratic in the Western sense, but that system works for them.
Well, you raise, as always, an interesting element in terms of evaluation. You're absolutely right. While China doesn't have democracy as we would define it based on liberal democratic values, we have seen over the last 50 years a fairly regular and peaceful transition of power take place in China. And I would add that in the 30 plus countries where you have no democracy in Africa, if they adopted a Chinese system, they'd be much further along than they are now. Having said that, it's one Supreme Court justice once said in terms of how do you know pornography? He said, well, you know it when you see it. Democracy is pretty much the same way. You know it when you see it.
Yeah.
If people have the right to peacefully assemble, if people have the right to vote, if there's clearly some degree of transparency in terms of how the electoral system is constructed. And then I think one of the critical indicators is that one which we've zeroed in on, and that is how many people have retired through a democratic process. And that's probably the most profound indicator. Most countries that are on our list have term limits, and we've seen time and time again, in 55 cases to be exact, where leaders responded to those limits. In some cases, we've had some one-term presidents on the continent, and when the electorate made known their wishes, those in charge stepped aside in a constitutionally prescribed fashion.
Interestingly, and I looked for Zimbabwe on your list, and it's not there. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that they are not where they ought to be in terms of democratic governance. I think the good news after Mugabe was deposed, that the new president went forward with the elections, was duly elected. That's a good thing. I think we need to wait for another cycle or two before the verdict is in as to whether or not Zimbabwe can rightly be called a part of the Democratic League. But it was promising that after Mugabe was deposed, that the government went forward with the regularly scheduled election. That was a good thing.
All right, so democracy partly is, as you say, elections and peaceful transitions of power. But we're starting to see a new thing where authorities are shutting the internet down whenever there's any kind of protest. And this silencing of voices is anti-democratic, isn't it?
It is. And quite frankly, in the countries that we count among the democracies on the continent, you see very little in the way of interference. While there are complaints relative to press freedom, the reality is when you look at most African countries, they have many more print media sources than you find, in other countries on a per capita basis. To a lesser extent, the electronic media is less developed. But when it comes to social media platforms, those countries that are democratic, people are pretty fully plugged in. And quite frankly, even though in those authoritarian regimes, what they're finding is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to completely cut a population off from the social media platforms. It's just too expansive, and that's a good thing at the end of the day.
All right, so I suppose as we start wrapping up, there's the glass half full and half empty, 17 out of 54 countries, but as you say, perhaps the populations that they cover is significant. And I suppose that as long as the graph over time is upwards, then we should be encouraged that democracy is taking root more and more. Is it because people are voicing much more than ever before? One of the things that we saw in Malawi were protests that we hadn't seen before in a country like that, and eventually they bore fruit. Is it that citizens being activists that's really changing the game?
Well, I think there are a number of things. Of course, they're activists. You always need leadership, in any situation. So activists, those on the point, are always important. But I think the driving force behind the democratization that we've seen, the transitions that we've seen, the fact that democracy is rooting to the extent that it is on the continent, is fundamentally driven by two factors. First of all, people do believe fundamentally that it's their inalienable right to participate in determining how they are governed. They should have a right. People fundamentally believe they should have a right to determine who their leaders are and to be able to hold their leaders accountable. The second thing is that the jury is in, that those countries that are democratic tend to be more prosperous. You've got all of this bad news around COVID-19 and the adverse impact that it's going to have on economies around the globe. South Africa has suffered significantly because of the measures that have been introduced to combat COVID-19. But just the other day, July the 1st to be precise, the World Bank declared that Tanzania, the United Republic of Tanzania, had achieved middle income status and had done that 5 years ahead of schedule. That's good news. Yes. And it's reflective of the fact that you've got a democratic regime in Tanzania, that politicians are held accountable. They felt a responsibility to deliver, and they have. And so, when it comes to democratization, I think people have figured it out. Look, unfortunately, democracy doesn't ensure that you're going to have one exceptional leader after the other. That's not the promise. The promise is that you'll be able to renew that tree of leadership on a regular basis. And over the midterm and the long term, you're going to probably wind up with more good leaders than bad. And probably even a few great ones sprinkled in between. And with that, you'll get some continuity in terms of good governance and growth.
And I think that's a great point to leave the conversation. Ambassador Stith, always good to talk to you. And thanks so much indeed for giving us some hope in the direction that the continent is going in terms of democratic values. Thank you so much, and stay safe. All right, that was